In May of 2022, 80 years after 120,000 Japanese Americans were interned in the United States, the Gresham, Oregon Historical Society did a program commemorating this tragedy. This is a video of that presentation focusing on East Multnomah County. I'm Gwenda McCall. In 1965, when I was a senior in high school, I said to my history teacher, I heard something about the Japanese families who lived around here being locked up during World War II. What is that? His response was, we don't talk about such a thing. And the subject was closed. We didn't have the internet, and I couldn't find anything about such a thing in history books. Truly, many Americans today are still unaware that the United States government rounded up 120,000 Japanese American men, women, and children and banished them to desolate outposts where they lived in meager conditions under barbed wire for most of World War II. Let's start with a short history lesson. The first Japanese person to settle in Oregon was a lady, Mio Iwakoshi. She married Andrew McKinnon, a Scotland-born Australian working in Japan. They settled in East Multnomah County in 1880. He named the area Orient in honor of his wife. Many of us are familiar with Orient Drive and travel it daily. Well, at that time in Japan, there was a famine, high taxes, and men were being drafted for their army, so Japanese men came here to start a new life. Mio helped many Japanese immigrants find jobs on farms, in lumber mills around Bridal Veil, or in Nihonmachi. Nihonmachi, or Japantown, encompassed 30 square blocks in northwest Portland in the area that we now call Chinatown or Old Town. Before World War II, thriving businesses catered to people of Japanese descent. Many lived above their shops, so the whole area was predominantly people of Japanese ancestry. Children fished in the Willamette River and played marbles on the sidewalks and hide and seek under the Burnside Bridge. Nihonmachi was a fun place for the East County Nikkei to visit because they could purchase familiar food, traditional clothing, and deal in the Japanese language. According to George Nakata, who grew up in Nihonmachi, there were over 200 families and 100 businesses, including hotels, a fish market, a general store, a dojo, a candy store, and many more. It was an active, thriving community. These three terms are important to know because I will be using them a lot. Issei, first generation of Japanese who immigrated. Nisei, second generation, children of the Issei, American-born citizens of Japanese ancestry. And Nikkei, all people of Japanese descent whose permanent residence is outside Japan. When the Japanese began immigrating to the West Coast, there was extensive prejudice against them. In 1908, the federal government, driven by pressure from the Western states, stopped immigrants from Japan, which stopped the migration of Japanese laborers. But the Japanese found a loophole that allowed family members of those already here to migrate. In the next 10 years, over 10,000 Japanese women came to the United States, many of them so-called picture brides. Some arrived with an extra $60 in a pocket so they could get right back on the ship and return to Japan if they did not like the looks of the man who met them at the dock. In 1922, the Supreme Court decided Japanese Issei could no longer become citizens. Then the 1923 Oregon Alien Land Law prohibited Issei immigrants from owning land, so they registered their land in the names of their American-born Nisei children. In 1924, Congress passed the Immigration Act, halting all Japanese immigration to the United States. Xenophobia, racism, and jealousy were three reasons for such laws. The Japanese were supposedly taking jobs from white laborers, and the Japanese crops were consistently larger, even though they often farmed some of the cheapest, worst land near airports and army bases. During the Depression, strawberries sold for 5 cents per pound. In 1940, they sold for 20 cents per pound. Our country had made it through the depressions and business was picking up. In East Multnomah County, farmers sold their crops at early markets, to Libby's and Steinfeld's, and to the Gresham Berry Growers Consortium. These farmers were hard workers. By the time World War II started, the Nikkei were raising 90% of Oregon's broccoli, 80% of the Brussels sprouts, and 65% of the asparagus. Many of the Nisei were purchasing seeds by the picture on the front of the seed packet, since they could only read and write in Japanese. Years of struggling using manual labor and dynamite were needed to clear fields of tree stumps and rocks. Remember, part of East County is called Rockwood because of all the rocks and trees that had to be cleared before planting. Businesses, farms, and families were thriving. Nikkei children attended Japanese school on Saturdays to learn to read and write in Japanese. This says, "My name is Ray Shiki." He attended such a school. You will be hearing more about Ray. He was a local farmer and very well liked by the community. Jack Ochita was another East County farm boy. His Issei father chose a bride for him from Hawaii named Shizuko. She was an American citizen. Jack met his bride on a San Francisco dock in November 1941. He admired her courage to come to meet a strange man and marry him. They were married December 7, 1941. The same day Japan attacked Pearl Harbor at 8 o'clock on a Sunday morning, killing over 2,400 Americans. The Ochitas never celebrated their anniversary on that date. Because the Nikkei resembled the pilots who bombed Pearl Harbor, prejudice against them was rampant. First, there was an 8 o'clock p.m. curfew. Then all their assets were frozen, which made it a little hard to make a house payment or a car payment. Then they were required to turn in all their guns, ammunition, and shortwave radios. In December, the FBI, led by J. Edgar Hoover, who was considered a tyrant by many, singled out 3,000 Japanese community leaders, 13 were women, and arrested them for fear they would be instigators of sabotage and espionage. These potentially dangerous spies were lawyers, doctors, teachers, ministers, bankers, and other businessmen, even a flower shop owner. One farmer was arrested because he had one stick of dynamite in his storage shed. The dynamite was to blow up tree stumps, but the FBI did not listen. East County men were sent to Rocky Butte Jail, where their meals were left in metal trays, on the floor, outside the cell bars. They had to reach out between the bars to feed themselves. Little Joni Nakayama Kimoto from Southeast Portland was 3 years old when the FBI came into her home without taking their shoes off. They had no warrant. However, they confiscated all of her Issei grandfather's reading books and prayer books just because they were written in Japanese, and they took her father's binocular and camera. When asked if the family had any guns, her parents said, "Well, no." But precocious little Joni said, "Oh, yes, we do, in the attic." She led the FBI to the attic and pointed them to a chest. Upon opening it, they found a toy cap gun. The East County farmers harvested some of their crops of spinach in early 1942. They planted strawberries and early potatoes. They seeded beds of cabbage and cauliflower, but they never got the chance to harvest the rest of their crops. On February 19, 1942, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, which authorized the Army to forcibly remove and relocate the 120,000 Nikkei living in the exclusion zone from the Pacific Ocean east for approximately 150 to 250 miles. This was justified in the name of military necessity. It's interesting to note here that FDR's wife, Eleanor, did not agree with his order, and she let him know it. Well, in March of 1942, the War Relocation Authority was established. Posters were nailed on every light post in town saying that everyone of 1/16 or more Japanese ancestry had to pack up only what they could carry, including bedding, linens, eating utensils, toiletries, personal items, no cameras, no pets. Since it was spring and summer was coming, some didn't pack winter clothing, which they would bitterly regret later. One preteen admitted that she only packed her party dresses. Parents dressed children in many layers so they could get more into the suitcases. They would be evacuated to a relocation center for their own safety. Some families had a 2-week warning. East Multnomah County had 5 days. That is 5 days to sell, store, or give away everything else they owned. Imagine what it would be like if you had 5 days to dispose of everything you own. Well, some, like the Fuji family, found a friend to keep their farm, their home, and all of the contents safe for them until after the war. But that was rare. The families in Nihonmachi had mostly Japanese friends who were dealing with the same dilemma. George Nakata said his dad had just bought a big, beautiful console radio for $100, which he sold to a policeman on the corner for $5. What caused this travesty of justice? War hysteria, long-standing racism, and the failure of the government to uphold the Constitution, which should have protected the Nikkei. 2/3 of those interned were American citizens, born in the United States. Half were under 18 years old. Their resemblance to the enemy made them targets for suspicion and hate. 120,000 people were fingerprinted and moved to temporary relocation centers by the War Relocation Authority. Most of the Nikkei in the United States lived on the West Coast. The exclusion zone is shown in this slide. Remember, people of Japanese ancestry in Hawaii and part of Alaska were incarcerated too. East of the exclusion zone, the Nikkei were free, so over 8,000 Japanese people moved east before they were incarcerated. Many of those found it hard to find work or housing because they looked like the enemy. It is estimated that 50 million people of German and Italian descent lived in the U.S. at that time. About 2,000 were relocated. Propaganda against the Yellow Terror was rampant. Posters and billboards demonized the Japanese. General John DeWitt organized the relocations and wanted to isolate anyone 1/16th Japanese. He even took a 3-month-old baby out of an orphanage, like that baby could be involved in sabotage or espionage. DeWitt was quoted saying, "A Jap is a Jap. It makes no difference whether he's an American. You can't change him by giving him a piece of paper." There was a cartoonist named Theodore Geisel who drew about 400 cartoons, always showing the Japanese with thick glasses and buck teeth. We know him today as Dr. Seuss. Why did the Nikkei meekly do as they were told? They believed they were showing their patriotism and loyalty to the U.S. by sacrificing everything they owned. Children were told to keep their mouths shut and not embarrass their elders. It was part of the culture of the Nisei to suffer in silence. The Nisei were raised to be positive and always make the best of a bad situation. But this experience was a terrible loss of dignity for them. Overnight, the 30 square blocks of Nihonmachi became a ghost town. This slide lists the names of some of the Japanese American farmers living in East Multnomah County before the war. I think that out of all these farms, the Fuji farm and the Tamura farm are the only farms still operating on the same land where they were before the war. Part 2. The Temporary Assembly Center at the Pacific International Livestock Exposition Center. On Thursday, May 2, 1942, Ray Shiki was 15 years old and peeling Brussels sprouts, preparing them for market, when he heard the news on the radio that people of Japanese ancestry would be relocated. They had 5 days to pack up only what they could carry into suitcases and duffel bags. Ray's dad sold his 1941 Pontiac and his GMC truck at a loss. Often they were lucky to get 10 cents on a dollar. Family photos and treasures were left behind. This tag would be similar to Ray Sheiky's tag. Their family number was 15528. The letter F after the number says Ray that was the 6th person in the family. A would be his father, B would be his mother, and C would be the eldest child, and so on. Parents would tag their family members and their baggage with the same tags. Ray's cousin in Japan had given him a samurai sword that had belonged to Ray's uncle. Ray treasured that sword. Since he could not take it with him, he buried it under a tree on their Damascus farm. After the war, he went back to dig it up, but he never did find it. Ray was a freshman at Gresham High School when he was bused to protective custody. The school bus pulled up in front of the school, and all the Japanese American students boarded while their classmates hung out the school windows calling goodbye, goodbye to their friends. Ray's friend Bob Hoffmeister and other friends followed the bus all the way to the exhibition center in their old jalopy, just because they wanted to know where he was going. After Ray was inside the 12-foot-high barbed wire fence, his friends stood outside the fence and visited with him until it got so late that they had to go home. Ray said it wasn't until then that he felt the overwhelming confinement of captivity. The guards had locked the gates. They had rifles with scary bayonets on the end that looked like swords. This was for real. The photo you see here was in the Oregonian newspaper, which was hostile to Japanese Americans before and after the war. 829 residents of East Multnomah County, regardless of age or infirmities, were loaded into buses by the Army and detained at the Exposition Center near Jansen Beach Amusement Park with a huge roller coaster called the Big Dipper. Today, the Livestock Center is the Expo Center in North Portland, and Jansen Beach was demolished to become a shopping mall. The government called this a temporary assembly center, but the residents called it the Barbed Wire Barn. 109 of the 829 East County Nikkei were children and teenagers. There was a total of 3,676 Nikkei living in the overcrowded exposition building that formerly held farm stalls for horses, cattle, and pigs. A board floor was built over the grates where the animal waste fell through, but the stench was awful. The smell and the fly problems were terrible all summer, and worse when they watered down the wood floors to cool the center. Spirals of fly paper loaded with dead flies hung everywhere. Birds flew freely overhead because there were no ceilings on the 8-foot-high plywood walls. Each family had a 20 feet by 20 feet room. Joni Nakayama Kimoto's mother made little Joni memorize her family number in case she lost her tag and couldn't find her way back to their room. There was no number marking each doorway, so it was easy to be confused. And there were no doors, just a canvas flap for privacy that didn't reach the floor, so the military could look under to check on the prisoners. The noise never stopped, even after the 10 o'clock lights out curfew, because there were no ceilings. Every baby cry or snore could be heard by several families in a wide radius. Traditionally, back in Japan, walls were paper thin, so people would keep to themselves. In their culture, it was considered rude to comment on what you heard outside your own space. Each family member had to fill a mattress ticking with straw for a bed. Little Henry Mishima was 7 years old. He remembers filling mattresses from a huge pile of hay dumped in the middle of the horse arena. Some people didn't realize the hay would compact, so their mattresses soon became very flat. Henry's brother Richard was sent out to find wood pallets that people could put down over the manure to make walkways. The toilet and bathing facilities were inadequate and had no curtains or separation for privacy. A person would sit on the toilet and look across the walkway to someone else sitting on a toilet who could look at him. It was crowded and sanitation was poor. All laundry was done by hand, even the diapers, and hung to dry in the family unit. The lines to the mess hall, to the bathroom, and to the washroom were always long. And to make matters worse, the food was awful and didn't sit well on stomachs used to eating rice, vegetables, and Japanese dishes. They ate cow tongue and mutton, too tough to cut with a knife. For 2 days straight, they were served smelt at breakfast, lunch, and dinner. The loss of freedom, privacy, and dignity was overwhelming. However, the Nikkei were resourceful. In 4 months at the center, they set up a weekly newspaper, an information center with interpreters, a lost and found, and a postal service, a hospital ward, internal police, several stores, an advisory board, and lots more. With help from the Red Cross and the Quakers, they received books and school supplies for the children. People were assigned jobs: cooks, waitresses, dishwashers, janitors, and more. Ray was told to be a busboy during meals. He worked diligently until payday, when he did not receive a check. Because he was underage, not 16 yet, he gave them back his apron and quit. He spent the rest of his 4 months detainment at the assembly center playing baseball with other teenagers. Some young teens said that baseball every day was the most fun they ever had. And some of the older teens said that working in captivity was a lot easier than farm work. Young children adapted. They didn't understand how devastating this was to their parents, because the parents hid all the negative feelings from them. Kodomo no tame ni translates to, for the good of the children. The adults tried to make life somewhat normal. Professional photographers like Ansel Adams were hired by the government to document everything, but they were instructed to take photos that did not show the insufficiencies and the wretchedness. Pictures show people smiling and laughing, but only the children could think living like this was fun. No one could understand why they were locked up without any due process of law, instead of locking up the people who were thought to be threatening them. Outside the barbed wire, the army guns were pointed in towards the Japanese families, instead of out towards the unknown danger. Every man, woman, and child 12 years and older was fingerprinted. On September 10, 1942, after 4 months of living in the barbed wire barn, the Army told the families to pack up so they could be moved to a more permanent camp. Every person and piece of luggage had to be tagged with the family number. No one told them where they were going. They were taken to the train station and loaded into train cars. Each car had one armed guard and a potbelly stove. The curtains were pulled shut so they couldn't see where they were going. They could smell train smoke and desert air, and some thought they were being taken away to be shot. Part 3, Minidoka. Minidoka is a Shoshone Native American word meaning vast expanse, a very appropriate word for Minidoka internment camp, which was built in the middle of a flat, dusty, sagebrush-dotted expanse. For 3 years, it would be home to over 9,300 Japanese Americans who were never accused or convicted of any crime. When the East County Nikkei arrived on September 10, they were greeted by 5 miles of barbed wire curved inward to keep the prisoners in, not outward to keep the intruders out. There were 8 tall guard towers with armed guards. The good news was they learned they were not going to be shot or sent to Japan. But there was lots of bad news. The first day they learned the camp was not completed. There was no running water or sewer system installed yet. They had no other choice than to use pit latrines that were fly-infested and unclean. There never would be running water in the barracks. It was all carried by hand in buckets from the laundry area. Here's an aerial view of Minidoka in Jerome County, Idaho, about 20 miles northeast of Twin Falls. The residential area was about 1 mile by 3 miles. If you wanted to walk from block 1 to block 44, it was miles because all the roads didn't go in a straight line. Let's take a look at the location of some of the East County Nikkei, starting from the red circle on the top, working down. The Shiki family and the Asakawa family lived in Block 31. The Ando family in Block 32. The Muramatsu family in Block 34. The Ono family and the Takashima family in Block 37. The Ochitas, a family of 7, lived in Block 39. The right-hand area was all vegetables and gardens and animal pens. The Nikkei were such excellent farmers and grew so much produce that they supplied other camps too. The living quarters were designed in units called blocks. A typical block had a mess hall and a separate laundry sanitary building that would be shared by 72 families up to 350 people. 12 tar paper barracks, each 20 feet by 120 feet, flanked the mess hall and laundry sanitary buildings. Each barrack held 6 families. A family of 6 to 8 lived in a 20 feet by 24 feet room. A family of 4 to 5 lived in a 20 feet by 20 feet room, about the size of a 2-car garage. A family of 2 to 3 lived in a 20 feet by 16 feet room. Each block had a block manager who settled problems and took requests to the military. In this photo of the people from Block 34, the blue line is around the block manager, Matsutaro Muramatsu, a very well-respected leader. In this close-up, you see Mary Muramatsu with a bandana on her head, who would grow up to marry Reishiki. Her sister Rose is rubbing her eyes, and 10-year-old Grace Muramatsu is in suspenders. Grace told me that during the day she would go with her dad on calls to settle problems, often to the boiler room, where the men would go to get away from the women and children, and to debate both sides of the internment. The block manager distributed the daily mail to the 72 families in his block, and Grace remembers people would knock on his door all hours of the night requesting help. Each room had one bare light bulb hanging from the ceiling, no electric outlets. The one potbelly stove burned coal, which was rationed, 1 bucket per day, and hand-carried from the coal dispensary. There was an army cot with 2 army blankets for each person. Over the 3 years in Minidoka, they would make more furniture out of scrap lumber. The walls and floors were inch-thick, rough-cut planks that had not been kiln-dried. So when they dried and shrank, large cracks seemed to grow between the boards. Often the floors had knotholes in the wood, so they covered the holes with tin can lids to keep out the weather, the vermin, and the insects. There were no sinks or running waters, no private bathrooms, no cook stoves. The lights-out curfew was 10 o'clock p.m. Residents lined up to use the showers and other bathroom facilities. They lined up for everything, including meals and their weekly ration of 2 rolls of toilet paper. Roy Ochida was 8 years old when he went to Minidoka with his family. He shared this information with me. Well, during the day, bathroom facilities were an exercise in patience because there were about 125 to 150 men and boys waiting to use the 8 toilets, 8 wash basins, and 8 shower heads. No doors, no divisions. One thing I really disliked was having to get dressed in the middle of the night to walk a block to the restroom facilities, plus trying to remember to bring the toilet paper, soap, and the hand towel with me. It wasn't too bad in the summer, but it was really miserable in the winter. The high desert climate was brutal for the Pacific Northwestern Nikkei. In the winter, snow would sift through any slight crack and make little snowdrifts on windowsills and on the floor. When the outside doorknobs froze, one lady crocheted doorknob covers for every exterior doorknob in her block. Random dust storms were awful. In the summer, the dust from the soil was like talcum powder. It would get in your nose, your mouth, your ears, your food, your bed, and ankle high on your boots. Women would press wet strips of newspaper into the cracks in the wall, anywhere light could come through, and sweep the floor with wet balls of newspaper to gather up the dust. The first summer they were there, the temperature reached 104 degrees. And that winter, it got down to minus 21 degrees. The tar paper barracks were not insulated, so the residents were often too hot or too cold. The seasons ranged from blinding dust storms and ankle-deep dust to ankle-deep mud when it rained. In November, there was so much mud, they laid 2x4s down to walk across. If you slipped off the board, you could lose your shoe in the deep, sticky mud. At first, Nisei men were assigned to be cooks in each of the mess halls. This was a difficult role reversal for these men because usually women did all the cooking in their homes. The food improved when professional chefs stepped forward. They were able to cook tastier meals out of the 31 cents to 45 cents per day ration provided by the government. Women were the servers and dishwashers. Reishiki's mother, Asa, was a dishwasher at $8 per month. Menus were reviewed by the Department of Agriculture for Nutrition, but the reviewers didn't consider that the Japanese diet was unique and it included daily rice. At first, the Nikkei had a lot of digestive issues because the food provided was so different than their accustomed diet. Vienna sausage, corned beef hash, powdered eggs, macaroni and cheese, canned applesauce, Spam, and lots of hot dogs. Finally, rice was delivered so they didn't eat so many potatoes and so much pasta. When their gardens grew, they were able to add their own produce. Roy Ochida remembered the food. He told me, mutton was prevalent and served many times as beef stew. It was doused yellow with curry as a disguise, but because of the awful smell and taste, I never ate it. They served a lot of organs like liver and tongue. The tongue was from cow to boiling water to plate. The rough texture of the tongue still makes me shudder every time I think about it. I hated the smell, taste, and texture of liver, so on liver night, I had bread with mayonnaise. However, my mother knew I would be hungry in an hour or two, so she always made a liver sandwich for me, which I ate later, grudgingly. In 1943, they cleared 200 acres, diverted water from the Snake River for irrigation, and raised 100 tons of produce. They also provided 25 hogs per week, 1,000 chicken eggs per day, and 4,800 birds for winter meals, and beef to the mess hall. They built a cannery, a pickling plant, and a tofu plant. The root cellar was 200 feet long by 40 feet wide and covered with earth. Some people believed the root cellar was the best place to work because it was cooler in the summer and warmer in the winter. In 1943, they grew 1 million pounds of potatoes and 100,000 pounds of carrots to store in the root cellar. After the first year, the whole camp was self-sufficient. And I have to stop and think here. They arrived in September, got through the rain, the mud, the snow, the cold, dust storms, and many daily inconveniences. And by the following September, the whole camp was self-sufficient? What a testament to organization and hard work. This is a typical mess hall. The mess hall gong woke the Nikkei for breakfast. Children were the only ones to receive milk, powdered milk, and only 1 6-ounce glass per day. Once a plate left the serving line, there were no second helpings for anyone. All food waste went to feed the hogs. Some blocks had better chef than other blocks, so it was not uncommon for people to sneak into a neighboring block's mess hall for a favorite meal. An unintended shift in family dynamics happened in the mess hall. Since the tables were long with benches on either side, it was easy for individual family members to slip into different groups outside the family unit, men with other men, teenagers with their friends. Losing family mealtime was just one reason that made it difficult for some families to maintain the traditional family hierarchy. Interesting sideline here. In March of 1943, the pickling plant was shut down temporarily. It was discovered that some of the residents were making sake there. Alcohol was prohibited in all 10 internment camps, but it was occasionally served at celebrations, so some clever people were secretly making it. Sake is brewed like beer rather than fermented like wine, so it could be ready to drink in 6 weeks. These next slides show some of the public services. There was a grade school, a junior high, and Hunt High School where Reishiki graduated. At first, schools needed more teachers and supplies. There were 700 50 students and only 10 WRA teachers, so several teachers quit. Nisei, with college degrees, stepped up to help teach. All the students said the Pledge of Allegiance every morning. There was a hospital where 489 babies were born. Lon Shiki said his cousin Dale Oishi was one of the first babies born in Minidoka, and Dale's younger brother, Bruce Oishi, was one of the last babies born. They are sons of Ray's oldest sister, Arie. There was a fire station and internal security police. This is Suematsu Ando, commonly called Pops Ando. The inmates policed themselves. Soldiers only interfered if there was an emergency. There was a coal dispensary to keep the potbelly stoves going. Tosh Okino worked as a coal swamper, loading and unloading coal every day. Ray Shiki drove a gas and oil truck. There was a newspaper called the Minidoka Irrigator, several churches, a post office, a library, a storage facility, and much more. There was no private industry, so businesses were cooperatives. There was a carpenter shop, a shoe shop, a mail order desk, a laundry if you could afford to send your laundry out, a radio repair shop, a beauty parlor, a barber shop, several stores, a flower shop, an in-camp shuttle bus service, and so on. Every able person had an assigned job: nurse, farmer, waitress, maintenance worker, firefighter, writer, etc. Ray Shiki's Issei father took care of the boiler for Block 31, so people had access to hot water. People received a token monthly salary deliberately set lower than a soldier's pay. Unskilled laborers were paid $8 per month. Teens and adults were paid the same amount. Doctors, dentists, and teachers were the highest paid at $19 per month. $1 in 1945 would be worth $16 in today's economy, but people still earned far less than they would have on the outside. This is a photo of Hideo Ochida on the right with his little brothers. Hideo, nicknamed Dates, D-A-T-E-S, for no apparent reason, was in high school at Minidoka. He shared these memories with me. We were a family of 7 in one room. High school was very crowded, small rooms. My dad was a cook for our Block 39. The food was crummy. I still cannot eat macaroni and cheese or canned applesauce, but I did gain weight. I didn't do sports. I worked picking potatoes. I also had a job as a grease monkey, worked in the auto pool. Spent my money on pastries and candy, and I liked to build model airplanes and crystal radios that I ordered from the Sears catalog. The radios didn't have a very long range, but I could listen to the war news. My biggest memory was when I was swimming in the canal and almost drowned. My friend Sam Hinatsu saved me. After 2 people did drown, they dug a swimming hole. The water was so muddy we had to be careful not to drink it. The Japanese word gaman means to be patient and bear the unbearable with dignity. Minidoka was easier on the young people than the adults. Children are just more flexible, and parents did everything they could to make life normal and pleasant for their children. They bore their disappointment with dignity. The adults did not complain in front of the children, or even after the war for that matter, because they believed they were doing their duty for the country. And understandably, some of them were just a little ashamed of being incarcerated. Mas Ochida was 11 years old when he went to Minidoka. He said, "Oh, living in camp wasn't bad at all. I had a lot of friends. We played sports, hiked, swam in the irrigation ditch, and I did what all kids do at that age." Roy Ochida said the only time he ever heard his mother complain while at Minidoka was when she was trying to cut out fabric using her scissors and pinking shears that were chopped off to be no longer than 4 inches. At that time, baseball was the country's favorite sport. They leveled off 14 baseball fields. Ray Shiki played ball with George Muramatsu, whose family farm was where the Portland airport is now. George had a pretty sister named Mary, who would later be Ray's wife. The prisoners who constructed a 9-hole golf course, a gymnasium, a skating rink, and volleyball courts. Boys played marbles and went fishing for trout in the canal with a stick, some string, and a safety pin for a hook. Movies like Rin Tin Tin were popular. There were choirs and orchestras and bands. The Minidoka Swing Band was very popular at dances. They played all the latest songs like Chattanooga Choo Choo and Boogie Woogie Bugle Boy and copied the big bands like Glenn Miller and Tommy Dorsey. Ironically, Don't Fence Me In by Bing Crosby was a favorite. The mess hall would be cleared for a dance, and the decorations were clever and inventive with the limited supplies on hand. Grace Muromatsu was too young to be invited inside, so she would stand on a box outside the mess hall window and watch her two older brothers jitterbug with girls to 78 RPM records. The WRA tried to Americanize the inmates with Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, and citizenship classes for the Nisei, even though they were not allowed to become citizens until 1952. On July 4, 1943, 3,000 Minidoka residents stood together under a starlit desert sky and sang, "God Bless America." As time went on and no one tried to escape, the inmates started to break down the 5 miles of barbed wire and use the wood posts for stakes in their gardens. Finally, the military just let everyone wander outside, even up into the hills, where they would gather grease wood to burn in the potbelly stoves and to use for carving. Women would search the shores of the canal for tiny shells to make jewelry. This 80-year-old corsage was made by Hideo, Mas, and Roy's mother from shells she picked up by the canal. The little snail shells are the size of a BB. You can see in the photo on the right that the back is just old cardboard. Nothing was wasted if it could be used or turned into art. In their spare time, they made beautiful things like embroidery, carvings, paintings, bonsai trees, and flower arrangements. This tiny pin was carved from the wood of an orange crate. The Minidoka residents were highly limited by what they could purchase on site, but they did have access to the Sears catalog that sold everything from prefab houses to clothes to garden seeds. And so many planted victory gardens to support the war effort. Here is Joni Nakayama Kimoto with her father by their garden. Many of the Issei were professional landscapers who created park-like settings with trees, flowers, and shrubs to soften the harsh terrain. Gardens improved camp conditions and brought harmony and serenity. Some of the gardens were planted right below the tall watchtowers to soften the prison-like atmosphere. This color photo is of a mess hall with a garden. The inset reminds you what they had to start with. One trait of the Issei was to always be busy. Idleness was frowned upon. Before we close this part 3, I'd like to share some random interesting points. Some Nikkei received permission to travel east of the relocation zone to live with other families, to work for higher wages, or to go to college, but that wasn't easy because of prejudice and hard to get housing. Some even returned to camp. This is Joni's pass to leave camp with her family. Her fingerprint would be on the back. Reishiki's sisters, Kisai and Sumie, went to Colorado to be housekeepers, and his brother Tan went to Spokane to work for the Spokane, Portland, and Seattle Railway. Ray spent a summer working in a cannery in Utah. He had to find his own transportation to and from. He considered just staying there outside the relocation zone where he would be free, but he went back to Minidoka to be with his family. The 1942 mixed marriage policy was a way for some people to leave Minidoka and go back home. If a person was multiracial or married to a non-Japanese person, and if they could prove they had a Caucasian-style home life, like what, not eating rice every day, they could be released. It was thought this policy arose so Caucasian husbands of Japanese women could not win a case in court and thus make the relocation illegal. As the war went on, every adult in a relocation camp was required to fill out the loyalty questionnaire. It was a full page of questions, but numbers 27 and 28 were the only ones the government cared about. Question 27, will you serve in the U.S. Army? Question 28, will you forswear your allegiance to Japan? Just one no could send a person to Tule Lake Relocation Camp in Northern California, a place no one wanted to go. Tule Lake had 3 layers of barbed wire fencing and held many people believed to be disloyal to the United States. When the draft came, men of eligible age who marked no on questions 27 and 28 were called no-no boys and sent to prison until the end of the war. On a day-to-day basis, the military administrative staff needed communication with the internees to establish administrative duties. They preferred to have second-generation Nisei representatives rather than Issei representatives because the Caucasian military had difficulty understanding the Japanese accent. The appointment of Nisei to these jobs put a strain on family dynamics since the children were telling the parents what to do. It is very important to recognize Tomi Takeuchi, who edited the Minidoka interlude and had it printed in Twin Falls. This album is in the format of a high school yearbook. All the people from each block posed in front of their barrack and had a group photo. Their names are listed below the photo. That's over 9,000 people. The book also includes many photos with lots of information, including the sweetheart of Minidoka. Minidoka is the only one of the 10 camps with such a recorded history. This book is definitely treasured by the people who own one. When I started my research, I couldn't find someone willing to loan me their Minidoka interlude until Tomi Takeuchi's daughter Tomiko asked her brother Tom to loan me his. Before we go on to part 4, I would like to point out that the dictionary defines concentration camp as a place where a large number of people are deliberately imprisoned in a relatively small area with inadequate facilities. Even President Roosevelt referred to the 10 camps as concentration camps. Part 4, the farm labor camp. Since so many men and women of non-Japanese descent joined the U.S. military and took wartime-related employment during World War II, the farmers in Malheur County, Eastern Oregon, were desperate for laborers to weed and harvest their crops, especially their sugar beets. Sugar beets were used for industrial alcohol, munitions, and synthetic rubber. They were vital to the war effort. The Amalgamated Sugar Company owned 12,000 acres of sugar beets in Eastern Oregon. Representatives went to the Portland Assembly Center to recruit Nikkei to work in the fields and avoid incarceration. The bachelors went first and then whole families. About 100 families packed up again and took a midnight train to Nisei, Oregon on the Snake River, about 40 miles northwest of Caldwell, Idaho. It was a city of matching tents with wood floors and potbelly stoves. At first there was no electricity, but the workers complained until it was provided. The first summer, temperatures reached 110 degrees. Water had to be carried in a bucket. Later, when it rained, their tents leaked and their beds were wet, so each tent received a waterproof tarp to put over the tent. Before the war, the Mishima family had a farm west of the Gresham Fred Meyer on Powell, where the Mount Hood bowling alley is now. Henry Mishima was 7 years old. He remembers how much he cried when he had to give up his dog, Judy, to the neighbors. When the Mishima family, the Kato family, and the Jacochita family decided to go to Nisei, the Nagaki brothers decided to go too, even though the rest of the Nagaki family was still in Japan. It had to be better than that stinking, crowded exposition center. So after 2 weeks, they all went to Nisei. You might remember that there were Ochitas in Minidoka too. The Ochitas are a large family with lots of cousins, and some still live in East County. When Tom Fuji was 13 years old, his father signed a contract at the Assembly Center so the whole family could be farm workers, father, mother, and 6 children. The children were disappointed because they thought they were going to have a vacation from farm work. It was important to his father to get his children out of that cramped, military-controlled living environment, to receive higher wages, but most of all, to send his 6 children to public school for a better education. Sugar beet work started in May. Laborers used a short-handled hoe for blocking each plant. Blocking is like weeding. They cleared a space of 6 to 8 inches between each plant, pulling up weeds and unneeded seedlings, so the beets had more room to grow in long rows. It was back-breaking work. Then they used a triangular blade attached to a small handle, or used a long-handled hoe to keep the blocking clear. There was no chemical to kill weeds, so the weeds just kept coming back. Sometimes they worked alongside German prisoners, who were actually paid more than the Japanese Americans were paid. At first, I couldn't find a photo of a sugar beet tool, so 93-year-old Tom Fuji drew this one for me. Starting in September, harvesting sugar beets required a large knife with a hook on the end. The hook was used to pull the beets out of the ground. Then the knife was used to cut off the beet crown and leaves. They spent the first half of the day digging up the beets and cutting off the tops. The second half of the day, they picked the beets up from the ground, stood, and tossed them into an open bed truck as it drove down the center of 2 rows. There would be workers tossing beets from both sides. Sometimes a person would accidentally toss the beet too hard, so it would go over the whole truck bed and hit a worker on the other side in the head. Sugar beets are usually 2 to 3 pounds, but they could be 5 to 10 pounds. A workday was 8 to 10 hours. Children in high school were sometimes excused from school to help, even though child labor laws were in effect. A workday started at 4:00 a.m. when open bed trucks arrived to pick up the workers. They didn't live on the farms where they worked. They were transported daily to a field. Sometimes the trip was 20 miles to get to the field that was assigned for that day. These farm labor families had one advantage that the families in Minidoka did not have. They ate their evening meal together. This kept the family unit together and kept the father as the traditional head of the home. This is the Ochita family at dinner in their tent. You will remember Jack and Shizuko at the far left were married on Pearl Harbor Day. Tom Fuji's older brother Ed was around 19 years old. He met a pretty girl named Aya Iwasaki from Hillsboro. It must have been love when you meet your soulmate covered with dirt, sweaty, and exhausted. Aya said she was so tired that sometimes she fell asleep in the field. Later, they were married 71 years. Aya's eldest brother brought his new wife to camp, so the couple had their own tent. The new wife was a city girl and chose not to do field work, so she stayed at base camp to cook on the potbelly stove and care for the family's needs, including packing their lunches every day: rice balls, a hard-boiled egg, and a can of 7-Up. Each family had to purchase their own food and prepare it. Bachelors paid to eat in a mess hall. The only thing that was free was the housing, so to speak. When the weather got too cold, the farm laborers were moved to vacant Civilian Conservation Corps cabins, CCC cabins, just 3 miles away. Several families in one barrack. The facilities weren't any better than at Minidoka. Ray Shiki spent the summer of 1943 working in fields near Nisei. He said he came back to Minidoka with a full wallet. The workforce was paid by the row for weeding onions and by the sack for picking potatoes. I mentioned Henry Mishima earlier. He's the youngest boy in this photo. Many of you will remember him as Dr. Henry Mishima, a well-known dentist in Gresham for over 45 years. He shared these camp memories with me. Well, I was only in the 2nd grade, but I went with our family to the labor camp where my parents harvested potatoes, beets, onions, and some lettuce. Women worked harder than men because after a day in the fields, women still had to care for the children, cook for the family, and do the wash. I played in the dirt with other children, but my best memory was getting a nickel to purchase an ice cream cone at the commissary. Oh boy, that was a special treat on a hot day. Later, my father saved enough money to rent a home from a farmer. Then we had actual rooms like bedrooms, a living room, and a kitchen. There were 2 Japanese families who already lived in Nisei, which was outside the relocation area, so they were free. They were so nice to all of us, even had dances in their yards. Tom Fuji did have 2 good things to say about the camp. Labor camp families were not under military control, and they had the freedom to go into the town of Nisei 1 evening a week for a couple of supervised hours. But let's remember, these farm laborers had menial living conditions, little pay, and long hours of back-breaking work. They didn't know what happened to their homes and farms that they were forced to give up. Part 5, the Nisei soldiers. Before Pearl Harbor was attacked on December 7, 1941, there were Nisei already in the Army. After Executive Order 9066, some were sent to non-combatant jobs like being cooks, and others were reclassified as 4C and discharged to join their families in Minidoka. These Nisei soldiers were born in the United States, making them American citizens, regardless of the immigration status of their parents. On February 1, 1943, President Roosevelt announced the formation of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, a racially segregated, all Japanese American unit, albeit with Caucasian officers. There were 4 segregated military units: the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, the 100th Infantry Battalion, which originally consisted of Nisei only from Hawaii, the 552nd Field Artillery Battalion, and the Military Intelligence Service, often called the MIS. The Nisei were known as the Little Iron Men because their average height was 5 foot 2 inches. They weren't tall in height, but they were towering examples of courage. Their motto was "Go for broke," an old gambling term which means shoot the works or risk all. 1,000 men and women from Minidoka enlisted, the largest number from any of the 10 concentration camps. Cause Fuji was one of them. When the 442nd arrived in Italy, the war-weary 100th joined them. The 552nd Field Artillery Battalion was sent north to push the Germans back. They traveled 1,100 miles through 40 towns in 60 days and chased the retreating Germans. In April 1945, the 552nd came across a Dachau concentration camp from which the Germans had fled. The prisoners thought the Japanese American soldiers were the enemy and had to be convinced that they were now free. Joe Onchi, whose family farm was on the northeast corner of Division and Birdsdale, Birdsdale's also called 202nd Avenue, was wounded in the ankle, and he remembers waiting for a medic to come get him. Jack Asakawa was a medic. All medics were unarmed. The Military Intelligence Service had nearly 6,000 Japanese-speaking soldiers shipped out to the Pacific to be linguists. They talked enemy out of caves, translated messages and documents, monitored enemy radio transmissions, interrogated prisoners, and comforted children. General Douglas MacArthur stated, "Never in military history did an army know so much about the enemy prior to engagement." And General Charles Willoughby said, "The Nisei saved countless Allied lives and shortened the war by 2 years. The East County Nisei took part in the surrender of Japan, and Tad Takeuchi was involved in the occupation after the surrender." Sometimes the Nisei felt they were being used as cannon fodder. The Lost Battalion in Northeast France is a name given to about 274 Texas soldiers who were surrounded by Germans. 2 regular battalions failed to rescue them, so the 442nd was sent in. Many Nisei died, but they did manage to save the Lost Battalion. There were so few Nisei left after the fight that when a general ordered a review, he growled, I ordered the regiment to stand in review. I mean the cooks and everyone. He was told, General, this is all that's left of the 442nd. The scaling of Mount Folgorita in northern Italy is another story of Nisei bravery. The Germans were dug in at the top of the hill. Other battalions failed to run up the hill to reach them. When the 442nd was called in, the troops agreed to climb the vertical cliff behind the German encampment to reach them. They waited for dark and taped their dog tags to themselves so they wouldn't rattle. They used no lights or radios and agreed not to talk. They reached the top, snuck up on the Germans who were looking down the hillside in the other direction, and took the hill. The public attitude became a little more positive when people began hearing about the successful missions of the 442nd. It is still the most highly decorated combat unit for its size and length of service in the U.S. history. Of the 1,000 who volunteered for Minidoka, 73 died, proving their loyalty. Their families were not released to attend their funerals. A gold star on a barrack door represented that family's sacrifice. Some doors had 2 stars. The names of the 1,000 soldiers are on the Minidoka honor roll at the gate to the site where people still make annual pilgrimages. I think that Roy Nakamura was the only Japanese American from Gresham who was killed in the war. After Minidoka was closed and when his family was planning a family funeral, his sister Setsuko went to a shop to get her hair done. The beautician said, "We don't work on Japs here." Setsuko said nothing. She just left quietly, which is a perfect example of Japanese equanimity. Later in the 1970s, her husband Toshokino and the Gresham Troutdale Japanese American Citizens League built the original Japanese garden in Gresham Main City Park as a gesture of goodwill. The garden has been beautifully restored. So where was Ray Shiki during all this? He was president of his senior class at Hunt High School in Minidoka and graduated in spring of 1945. In August, he was drafted and sent to the anti-tank unit. The war ended that fall, so he never saw action. However, he stayed in as a supply sergeant for the MIS language school until November of 1946, and still found time to play baseball. President Roosevelt died in April 1945. In August of that year, President Harry Truman offered Japan unconditional surrender. They declined, so he gave the go-ahead to drop the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki that ended the war. We've heard so many sad tales in this section. Let's end the military section with a love story between a Nisei soldier and his girlfriend. Mamoru Kido, commonly called Fred, was one of 8 children from a farming family in Boring. Haruko Koba, commonly called Spring because Haruko means spring child, lived with her family in Seattle. They met when they were in high school at a dance, probably at the Buddhist temple in Portland. Fred's brother says after the dance, Fred came home very happy, singing something like, "My sweetheart, my sweetheart." Well, after the dance, Spring went back to Seattle. Fred and Spring kept up their friendship by mail, never dreaming that in less than a year, both families would be incarcerated in the same place, Minidoka. Spring was in Block 15 and Fred was in Block 29, which sound rather close together, but the Minidoka living area encompassed several miles. Well, surely they could walk and meet in the middle. But remember Minidoka's extreme weather conditions. Much of the time it was too hot, too windy, too dusty, too rainy, too muddy, too cold, or too much snow. Travel by foot was not always easy. In April of 1943, Spring received a pass to leave Minidoka to be a housekeeper in Jerome, Idaho. So Fred enlisted in the Army and left to join the 442. After the war, Fred went back to farming, and Spring and her family went back to Seattle to their home that had been kept for them. The first thing her father did was run down the basement stairs to see if the secret room he had constructed under the staircase was intact. It was. All their family photos and treasures were untouched. Soon after, Fred and Spring's wedding photos were added to the family album. It only seems fitting that the U.S. Postal Service released the Go For Broke stamp in May 2021 to honor the Nisei soldiers. Here is a list of some of the East Multnomah County Nisei who served in World War II. Part 6, End of Incarceration. In December 1944, the Supreme Court ruled that war relocation was wrong, so everyone was free to leave Minidoka and the farm labor camp. Those who left were given $25 and a one-way train ticket back to where they came from. After 3.5 years of confinement, some found their homes vandalized. 2,250 residents at Minidoka refused to leave because they had nowhere to go. Their homes, farms, and businesses had been taken from them. The Minidoka project director resigned when he was told to force everyone out. The new director told the cooks to use up all the food because he wasn't going to buy any more. Then the water was shut off, so they had no showers, toilets, or laundry. At that time, it was difficult to find housing and jobs even for returning veterans. This poster shows a meeting at Gresham High School in March 1945. The last paragraph reads, "Damascus farmer just ordered to vacate his home because of court action by an evacuated Jap." Excuse me? This farmer moved into an evacuated Issei or Nisei home and doesn't want to give it back to the original owner? Most Nisei did not get their homes back and had to start all over again. The Fuji family and the Shiki family had very different experiences. As I mentioned before, the Fuji family had a friend to take over their home and their farm for them until they returned. They were glad to be home, in spite of the fact that some Gresham community leaders formed a group to discourage anyone of Japanese descent from returning. There were "No Japs Allowed" signs in Gresham and Troutdale store windows. The only grocery stores where the Nikkei could shop were Zimmerman's 12-Mile Corner at Stark and Eastman Parkway, where there's a car dealership now, and at the Troutdale Country Store. Jim Fuji said on their first day back in town, he and his dad saw Larry Aylesworth standing with a bunch of men on Main Street across from Miller Kidder Hardware, where the Thai Orchid restaurant is now. He said, "They all stared at us. Then Larry walked away from them, came across the street, and put his arms around my dad and shook his hand. He did it in front of God and everybody. I've never forgotten that." Individual cases of friendship were treasured. The Shiki family was not as lucky as the Fuji family. Before the war, they were buying 55 acres in Damascus in the name of Ray's sister, Arie. A friendly man at the cannery agreed to take their payment to the bank and put it on the mortgage every month. When they returned from Minidoka, they learned that the man had originally put the land in his name, and they had been paying on land they did not even own. With no place to go, they found a place to rent in North Portland in Vanport, a city of 40,000 people. Luckily, they accumulated enough funds to move out before the big flood. Ray and his brother Ton decided to continue farming. In 1948, they found a piece of property on Hogan Road, also called 242nd Avenue, owned by Bob Wilson, who agreed to let them farm for part of the produce, a sharecropper arrangement. Ray's parents moved into the old house on the property. Ray and his wife, Mary, remodeled an old barn for themselves and their 3 children, Rick, Lon, and Gail. Lon likes to tell the story that whenever a person says, "Shut the door, were you born in a barn?" he says, "Why, yes, I was." Ray said the people who were their friends before the war were their friends after too. Ray always believed that one day his farm would make a nice golf course. The Shiki farm is now the Persimmon Golf Course and Country Club. In his book, Along the Sandy, Our Nikkei Neighbors, Clarence Mershon wrote, "Because of their intelligence, educational achievement, discipline, and work ethic, most Nisei prospered after the war. The fact that they essentially recovered in one generation is also a testament to their resilience, their equanimity, their work habits, their thriftiness, and their family values. I would like to close with a reminder that not one person of Japanese descent was ever convicted of sabotage or espionage. Do you remember my history teacher who said, "We don't talk about such a thing"? Well, we need to talk about such a thing, so similar injustices will never be repeated. Thank you for watching.